weather, isn't it? At least it's not 0 degrees. It's one thing about the weather in Cincinnati. If you don't like it, wait a day. Be something else. About 2 minutes of going to breakfast, Patricia.
And that would have been okay.
I know. Please? Well, unfortunately, I don't have a flimsy excuse now. Sadly, though, I saw an ambulance.
What's going on?
Hey, where's the lucky history?
Somewhere out there might be a decent sign.
When someone put one of the Subway wrappers way too close to a heater. That sounds about right.
Well, let's see if I can follow that. I guess because we didn't have a Monday this week, today's going to be our Monday.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if I can get restarted here. We only lost 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
10 to 15
I
minutes
can't
into
tell time,
rain.
I'm a historian. All righty, as I pointed out last Wednesday, with the closing of the West, especially with the census of 1890, that said there was no longer a large internal empire to conquer, an era in American history has passed. Ever since the founding of this nation at Jamestown in 1607, we've been focused on internal expansion from the East Coast to the West Coast. And now we've accomplished that. And by the way, this is an era when we start getting romantic about the, quote, Wild West. This is when the Western shows are extremely popular, like Wild Bill Cody's Wild West show. They're extremely popular back east and in, because with the closing of an era, we start to romanticize the West. But we also start to look outward. The United States is now a large, booming industrial power. We're the greatest industrial nation on earth. Our population is rapidly expanding, both from natural increase and from immigration. For all of our wealth and industrial might,
Uh-oh.
yeah, those are firemen. Those are.
Something's still on fire.
Yeah, that's a distinct possibility.
Something's still on
Oh
fire.
well.
Subway's still burning. Yeah, Subway's still burning down.
Oh, there is. Oh, there it is.
Come on.
Yeah, it's a bumper.
Oh.
That's the job my dad did. He was an engineer in the Cincinnati Fire Department.
I know, apparently, that we're in a burning building.
I came close to rushing into burning buildings for a living.
At least.
He talked me out of it.
Instead of wood.
Anyway, as I was saying, I know that's a distraction, folks, but as I was saying, for all of our industrial might, we were not a world power. I wouldn't even say we were an insignificant world power, because we weren't one at all. The United States in the late 1890s, early 20th century was really a different nation in many ways internationally. To begin with, we were traditionally neutral. Today, the United States has a series of alliances around the world. NATO, for example, being the largest and most powerful. But back then, we were officially neutral. We were allied with no one. But again, we also had no enemies. We had a tiny military establishment. We couldn't threaten anybody. There was only 26,000 men in the entire U.S. Army. That's the equivalent today of a little more than one Army division. Our Navy ranked 12th in the world. At the end of the Civil War, we were rivaling the British for the world's largest. But right after the Civil War was over, the government, to save money, basically sold off a bunch of the ships, and the few they had left pretty much ended up rotting and decaying. We couldn't have protected ourselves against a fleet of rowboats by the 1870s. So we had no saber to rattle. Even if we wanted to be a world power, our military was insignificant back then.
What year is that?
We're 1880s, 1890s.
So all people fought for that? People fighting?
Please?
So it's just people fighting for that?
What do you mean?
No army?
Oh, no, we had an army. It was just very tiny.
Just kick some ass.
Yeah, we,
Just the rebel army? Were we rebels?
no, we just had a small regular army. Yeah.
They
No.
seem to do a good job.
For a long time, they didn't do much of anything.
So by 1880, they stopped.
Yeah, well, it was, but the overall army was tiny and untrained, to be honest. We really didn't need one. You know, there was nobody threatening us. Now, this is an age of expansion and imperialism. European powers, and also a rising Asian power, Japan, had embarked on what becomes the last great age of imperialism. The more technologically and industrially advanced European nations begin to slice and dice up the rest of the world as colonies and spheres of influence. The process that led to the founding of America was the first great age of imperialism. This is the last great age. And it's fueled by many things, many concerns. To begin with, the industrialized nations needed raw materials. As I said, the United States, more so than the other industrial powers, had the raw materials we needed. But even we needed certain things that we didn't produce. Rubber. Back then there was no synthetic rubber, at least none that actually worked. They were experimenting with it, but it had a tendency to melt in summer and freeze and shatter in winter. That's not exactly, a good substitute for the real thing. So we had to import natural rubber. You can't grow that in the United States. It's a tropical plant. Tungsten, an extremely valuable metal. It's one of the few we don't produce in quantity here. And every other industrial nation needed resources as well. Where are you going to find them? Overseas. Secondly, all these industrial powers, the United States included, were now capable of producing everything their nations needed. All the shoes, all the shirts, all the food, except Britain, they had to import food. But industrially, we could produce far more than we needed. So industrial powers began looking to the non-industrial world for new markets. The British made a fortune selling manufactured goods to their empire in India. I mean, you got an empire of several 100 million people in the subcontinent alone buying British goods. So they need markets outside their own nation. And by the way, it's hard to break the markets of the other industrialized nations because, like the United States, they often had protective tariffs. The one exception was Great Britain. They were the great leaders in world trade. They didn't need protective tariffs. Third, the reason for this new age of expansion, the industrialized powers needed coaling and naval bases around the world. There had been a revolution in ships, which is one of the reasons the United States will be able to catch up within a decade when they finally decide to do so. Steam had been in use in warships since the 1840s on a regular basis. But metal ships, metal-hauled ships, had only developed in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Despite what you get taught in school, the Monitor and the Merrimack were not the first steel ships. They were the first two to fight each other. But the British and French already had launched all metal ships by that point. That revolutionizes naval warfare. These ships are coal-powered. They're steam-powered. And it has certain advantages over the old wind-powered ships. Now you could go anywhere you didn't depend on the wind, and you could go a hell of a lot faster. What's the drawback?
Nico.
Thank you. Yeah, you got to bring your power source with you now, don't you? Wind's free. You know, you might be becalmed for a couple days, not like it, or a contrary wind, but it's free. You can sail, and they did, all over the world and not have to worry about fuel. Coal ships are a little different, aren't they? You got to bring your own lunch. A large warship on the era of the eve of World War I, for example, in the early 1900s, a battleship at full speed could burn 200 tons of coal a day. Yep. So did the big luxury liners, like Titanic and Lusitania. They had huge holds that could hold maybe upwards of 2,000 tons of coal. But prorate that out at full speed, that's only 10 days. It's a lot less if you're going quarter speed or something like that. But you got to bring your own fuel. So the European nations needed military bases for that. The range of the ships had been reduced dramatically. That's one reason the United States has its eyes on Hawaii, by the way, as I'll get to. And how do they justify conquering other nations for their own benefit? Seriously, how do they justify this?
It was their God-given right to conquer.
Yes, religion comes into it a lot.
The same way we do now. They need help, so we're gonna help.
Actually, you're right.
We say you need help.
Yes, thank you.
We say you need help.
We
You're
say
getting
you
help.
need help.
You need us now.
And you're going to take it whether you like it or not, right? Yeah. Remember social Darwinism? the excuse the robber barons used for getting filthy rich and exploiting their workers who lived in poverty, hey, you can apply that to international situations as well. The industrialized nations had to help and take care of these small, developing nations. These primitive, backward peoples. I mean, think about it. That was the British excuse for conquering India. India was highly civilized 2,000 years before Britain ever existed. They looked at the British as barbarians, even if they did have tea at 4. So yes, social Darwinism had a lot to do with it. And pure, unabashed racism. White European powers conquering non-white nations for their own good. Now, American expansion and a strong military to go with it had tremendous support in the government and the population. Secretary of State at one point, John Hay, remarked that nothing could rival imperialism as a fine expression of the American spirit. That's what America's all about, conquering other people, right? Elihu, very important Secretary of War back in this era, helped really bring the U.S. Army into the modern world, remarked, quote, "Nations with power were obligated to use it." And one of the great naval theorists of the day, Alfred Thayer Mahan, remarked, "Our rights should depend upon the will of no other state, but upon our power to enforce them." Mahan is going to be one of the most influential people of his age. And how many people have ever heard of him? He helps change the course of this nation. Doesn't do it single-handedly, but he writes one of the most important books in history. Yes, books can change the world. Only if people open them and read them, by the way. Good luck, guys. This book was a history. It was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in it, Mahan argues that for too long, nations have seen oceans as barriers. We always did. We always felt protected by the fact we were over here and there was an Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe and a Pacific between us and Asia. Mahan said that was wrong. Oceans aren't barriers, they're superhighways. And that superhighway goes both ways. If you really want to be a great world power, if you really want to protect your nation, you need to control those highways, don't you? It was a perfect argument for the expansion of naval power and domination of the high seas. And by the way, when the British read the book, and of course they did, they said, aha, that validates everything we've been doing for the last half century. And actually it did. It had a great impact on Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany. It helped convince him that Germany needed a great navy to rival the British, which is one of the things that will lead directly to World War I, the second deadliest war in all of world history, rivaled only by its sequel. World War II. And in the United States, it's going to help turn us into a military power and an imperial power. Like I said, we had this huge navy, powerful navy at the end of the Civil War, but not having any militaristic intentions around the world, and the fact that it costs tons of money, like it does today. Congress, as I pointed out, sold off most of the ships, didn't build any new ones for about 20 years, and let the old ones decay. After Mahan's book, and by the way, he wasn't the only one thinking along these lines, but he certainly crystallized it and put it in terms that focused everybody's attention on it. So he had supporters. But it was after the publication of this book, and he was highly influential in the U.S. Navy and the government, we started building a new Navy. And by the way, we had advantages. The old one had decayed, but the old one had been obsolete. There had been a revolution in naval warfare between the 1860s and the 1890s, and almost any ship that had been built earlier was obsolete. So even though we're starting more or less from scratch, technologically our ships would at least be equal to the best ships other countries had. So we start rebuilding our Navy and expanding it. And because of that, we need overseas cooling stations. Now, the United States already had colonies in a way, but they had been acquired quite peacefully. We acquired our first two in 1867. One was a tiny island out in the Pacific that will be extremely important when we get to World War II. One of the greatest naval battles of all of history will be fought there. Little place out in the middle of the Pacific known as Midway Island. What else did we acquire that year in 1867? Something much, much bigger. And unfortunately, much, much colder. Thank you. Secretary of State William Seward bought Alaska from the Russians. And by the way, he was ridiculed for it, and it was called Seward's Folly. Had no idea about all that oil under the North Slope, did they? But neither of these, Midway was way too far out in the Pacific, and Alaska was just considered a big iceberg back then. Now, we start setting our sights on Hawaii. Hawaii was an independent Polynesian kingdom. Its government was recognized by other governments around the world. It was ruled by Queen Liliuokalani. By the way, she's college educated, here's Hawaii. Here's right where I'd like to be right now, honestly. Maybe we could take a class field trip, right around the time of Pearl Harbor, when we get to that. Tell the college we all have to go visit Pearl Harbor. How's that?
Sounds good.
I'm in there, revoke my tenure, and I'll be...
You might be able to talk me.
Talking them into it is the easy part. Getting them to fund it would be the difficult part. But I'd be happy to lead the trip, folks.
That's what I said. Talking to the grant.
Very big of me to offer to lead that trip. There's Queen Liliuokalani. Say that 3 times real fast, holding your tongue. And by the way, to show you that she isn't some, quote, savage or something like that, this is her house. This is Lilonii Palace. Nice digs, isn't it? Now, American sugar growers had been in Hawaii for about a generation. Sugar used to be a huge, huge commodity in Hawaii. They don't grow much sugar there anymore. It's mostly tourist industry. But pineapples and sugar used to be the two big agricultural products coming out of Hawaii. In 1893, American sugar growers in Hawaii, with the help of U.S. Marines, overthrew her legitimate government. And they asked to be annexed by the United States. 1893. By the way, that was an old trick in American history. Remember Texas? Well, the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, one of the few Democrats in this era, I might add, and also the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was president, then he lost to Benjamin Harrison, and then he got elected again. So he was the only president to serve 2 terms, but not consecutively. Cleveland was not an imperialist, and he believed that the overthrow of Queen Lily of Kalani was illegitimate, and it was, by the way. So he refused to recognize the new American government that the sugar growers had established, or annex Hawaii. But Congress was far more conservative and far more imperialistic. They couldn't overrule the president on this, so what they did was pass a law granting Hawaiian sugar duty-free privileges. They didn't have to pay any import taxes on the sugar. Now, good deal for the American consumer in the long run. But much like in physics, in history, every action has a reaction. We favor Hawaiian sugar, and at the same time, Congress passes a new tariff, putting higher taxes on Cuban sugar. So an event in Hawaii impacts another island nearly 7,000 miles away. It's going to have international repercussions for the United States. The reason it's going to have repercussions is because the Cuban sugar industry basically had 2 huge markets. They were a possession of the Spanish Empire, so they had a Spanish market, but their other huge market happened to be the United States. So what happens to the Cuban sugar industry when we slap a big tariff on it? What, they switch to cigars? What's going to happen in the Cuban industry? Thank you. Causes a recession in it. No. The recession kicks off the second Cuban Revolution. The first one had occurred about 20 years earlier. This is the beginning of what's known as the second Cuban Revolution. And by the way, it just wasn't the American tariff that did it, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Cuban people have been very eager to break from Spanish rule, and they had a lot of grievances anyway. But when the recession hit, that did it. That's what really touched things off. So in 1895, the Cuban Revolution, led by Jose Marti, begins. And Marti, who is the great national hero of Cuba even today, he's their George Washington, quite frankly, he makes the worst mistake any revolutionary leader can make. He gets killed in his first major battle. Doesn't help, does it? Where would we be if Washington would have been killed, at the Battle of Trenton, for example? My God, we'd all be speaking English today. Think about it for a second. Or not. We'd still be an English colony. I'm glad this isn't a comedy club. Marti gets killed in his first battle, and even though the revolution goes on, it at this point is kind of limping. And to make matters worse, the Spanish bring in a new governor, a military general, Valeriano Weyler, better known by his nickname, the Butcher. Sounds more like a wrestler, doesn't he? Valeriano the Butcher Weyler. Tough crowd today, guys. Here's Jose Marti. By the way, here's the statue to him in Central Park in Havana. Even under today's communist regime, he is still the great national hero of Cuba. And here's our butcher. And by the way, last name doesn't sound particularly Spanish, does it? What is it? Weyler. German. Yeah. Goes to show his family had lived in Spain for like 200 years already. Immigration, folks, people have moved all over the world, throughout history. So it wasn't that strange. He's got a German last name and German ancestry, but he was thoroughly and utterly Spanish. Weyler declares martial law and brutally suppresses the revolution. He begins to round up the population in some of the more rebellious areas and puts them in what he calls reconcentration camps. Concentration camps, basically. And by the way, do not confuse those with the German death camps of World War II. The Germans had both concentration camps, where they put people they didn't like and threatened their regime, and they were horrible and brutal, but the death camps were something else. The death camps were designed strictly to kill millions of people. And a lot of nations, sadly, have used concentration camps. The Spanish will use them in Cuba, the British will use them in South Africa, and down the road, as I'll show, the United States had them in World War II. Who did we put in them?
Japanese Americans.
Thank you. 110,000 Issei and Nisei, Japanese immigrants and first-generation Americans. 60,000 people in this country, American citizens, were detained illegally during World War II based simply on their ethnicity. The Spanish are really the first, though, to pioneer the use of concentration camps, and in their case, they're quite brutal. I want to point out the American camps like Manzanar and all that in World War II. The people were illegally detained, but the conditions weren't bad. You lived in a barracks type situation, but you had plenty of food and it was warm and there were schools and things. You weren't brutalized or anything. These were horrible. People starved, sickness was rampant, and probably as many as 1/4 of the people Weyler put in concentration camps died. how does that affect us? Because of these guys. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And based on the names, guess what business they were in?
Writing.
And what business is that?
Writing?
Huh?
Writing?
Newspapers. The Cincinnati Enquirer actually won a Pulitzer last year. It's for the best in journalism, prize named after him. Pulitzer and Hearst were newspaper magnates. They owned the two largest newspaper chains in America. And keep in mind, that was before we had cable TV and the internet and 7-day-a-week, 24-hour quote news programs, all that. People actually got their news from newspapers. People actually read them. Hearst controlled a newspaper empire, as did Pulitzer. The flagship newspaper for Pulitzer was the New York World, and Hearst was a New York Journal. But they both owned hundreds of newspapers around the country. And they were fighting a vicious circulation war. Now, ironically, one of the tools for attracting new customers was a relatively new innovation for newspapers. Newspapers in the late 19th century kind of underwent an evolution. You ever see a newspaper, Cincinnati Enquirer, for example, and it was around back then, from like 1860? You don't hang out in archives much, do you? The newspapers, you didn't have big flashy headlines. You had small headlines, densely packed writing and all that in there. It didn't usually have a sports page or an entertainment section or comics. It was just news and editorials. Well, beginning in this era, newspapers began to change. After the Civil War, a lot of newspapers began to add sports sections, especially with the rise of boxing and the first baseball, the creation of the National League and things like that. They also started adding comics. And the most popular one in the nation at the time, which is hard to fathom, was the Yellow Kid. His name was Mickey Dugan. And he originally appeared in the New York World. Then Hearst stole him away for the Journal. And by the way, we don't have, especially today, don't have the time. But if you want to go online and see what a typical Yellow Kid cartoon was like, it's not like a modern comic strip. That's what it looked like. It's not Pearls Before Swine or Peanuts. In addition to fighting over these cartoons, like the Yellow Kid, a lot of the newspapers started running sensational headlines and sensational stories. And by the way, that's how they got the nickname Yellow Journalism, because of this cartoon, the Yellow Kid. The newspapers would run headlines about, white slave ring exposed and, things like that. They were looking for sensational stories, more akin to the National Enquirer than the Cincinnati Enquirer, okay? Of course, I haven't seen too many stories about two-headed space aliens in National Enquirer lately. Now, this was a two-headed beast in many ways. On one hand, it led to a lot of sensationalist journalism, anything to capture headlines. On the other hand, it spawned investigative journalism, serious, honest investigations of major issues and major problems. So they're not only running sensational headlines, they're also exposing the illegal business activities, for example, of Standard Oil. So a lot of this new journalism is extremely positive. They had the nickname muckrakers, but it was rather positive. But there's a dark, seamy side to it as well, the sensationalism. And by the way, some newspapers decided to stay apart from this whole mess and remain responsible journalists. One of them was the leading rival of both the Journal and the World in New York, the New York Times. Anybody know what the banner slogan is for the New York Times? It's on every newspaper, right below the name. All the news that's fit to print. And they have had a sterling reputation for journalism, honest, decent journalism, for a good 150 years by now. So not all newspapers were involved in this, quote, yellow journalism. And even some of the ones that were did some serious investigative reporting. Now, they're looking for sensational stories. Where are you going to look? What's going on in the world that might be of interest? Yeah. Actually, they run stories on that. What about the revolution in Cuba? It's 90 miles off our coast, folks. We pay attention to those things. Hearst and Pulitzer both latch on to the war. Now, the problem is, by the time American newspapers get interested in the war, Weyler, with his cruel methods, had largely suppressed the revolution. Hearst sends the famous painter Frederick Remington down to Cuba to paint the revolution. That sounds funny, doesn't it? Photography obviously was already like about 80 years old at that point, but it was still difficult to do, battlefield, photography and things like that. And he was a famous painter. He goes down to Cuba and finds things relatively calm. So he telegraphs back to Hearst, all quiet here, no war. Hearst replied, quote, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." And he wasn't kidding. And on Friday, we're a look at the Spanish-American War. Well, have a good and hopefully uneventful day.